Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey all, one final note. I wanted to talk for a second about our upcoming webinar. It's on May 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 Pacific. It's going to be with Dan Mall. Dan and I are going to get together and talk about the Design Systems Buying Guide. It's going to be a great conversation. Feel free to register at knapsack.cloud, or we'll stick something in the show notes. Hope you all have a great day. Hey everybody, this is Chris with the Design Systems Podcast, and today we're doing something a little bit different. Hey Kendall, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here, Chris.
So this is actually me turning over the host role to my friend Kendall, who I've known now for many years. And we've had opportunities to chat design systems, about the web, etc., many, many times through various different career pathways. Kendall had this idea that maybe we should do a little role reversal. So here we are.
Yeah, ready to turn the tables and ask you a few questions for a change, right, Chris?
Totally. Well, thanks for doing this. I'm really, really stoked. Why don't you tell folks about yourself for a quick second?
Sure, yeah. I think we actually got connected in the Drupal community, probably a DrupalCon event. My history is just that I started as a front-end web developer and designer back in the day, got connected to Drupal probably at least more than 10 years ago. So I've been in it for the long haul. And then through my career, I made my way into Red Hat, kind of moved into, enterprise design systems and got plugged into a lot of cool stuff that was happening there and ended up doing program management. And a big part of that was the design system at Red Hat. And now I'm an engineering manager at a startup. And so they're kind of just getting their sea legs with design systems. So I'm a little bit less involved than I once was, but still passionate about the topic.
Nice. Well, thanks for doing this. I'm super stoked to dive in. So let's get started.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's see here. I'm going to start out with a couple of questions, 2 questions in one for you, but maybe the answer is the same for both. So the first question is, what did you want to be when you grew up? And when you were a child? And then if you could do anything, 9 to 5, and money were no object, what would you do?
Well, so it's actually kind of a funny answer to this, right? So like every kid that grew up in like the late 80s, I wanted to be a marine biologist because they were super cool. And you got to work with dolphins and whales and sea otters and stuff like that. But I mean, honestly, for a long time, it was river guiding that was my passion. I loved being on the river. I loved being outdoors. I've been out in the Grand Canyon in an inflatable raft twice for like 20 days. And so that ended up being something that I was really passionate about. And it's actually a big part of how Evan, my co-founder, and I know each other is through river guiding. I was a professional river guide for 10 years. He'd been down most of the rivers that I'd been down. And that was like an early bonding conversation for us, was around that. But nowadays, it's a little harder to get out on the river with the kiddos. But if I could do anything 9 to 5, it'd probably be like have a papaya plantation in Hawaii where I just dig in the dirt and live off the grid. And I mean, I don't know. It's funny, right? Like I work on the internet every single day, all day long. But I definitely have this like Luddite part of me that just wants to like not have a cell phone and not have a glowing rectangle that I look at every single day.
I feel that.
But I mean, what I do now is really fun. Like I really enjoy my job. I really enjoy being CEO. I really enjoy like the creative process of a startup. Like I've always been in like very hard creative situations where it's about like making a website or, running a program or like trying to get, humans aligned to go do things. This is kind of a different way to be creative where I get to like build a company that is, if we're successful, we're going to change the way people think about digital products.
Yeah, that's awesome. By the way, I feel like there's a Portlandia joke tucked in there somewhere as you're from Portland and they have this whole Ayo River.
Yeah, right.
I hope you've shouted that at least once.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of times where like you get a little, I don't know, like loose, free. I'm not exactly sure what the word is, but you spend a little time on the river with some people and you get to know them in this pretty extreme circumstance. And oftentimes you break out in song on like day 10.
Yeah. Absolutely. That happens. And I think we could apply the metaphor forward. So like your role as a CEO, right, is like you're helping your team navigate this river, this journey through life, right? And kind of adapt to the changes in the market and how, companies are using design systems, especially how much they've changed over the last 10 years, right? It's been pretty dramatic.
It's funny. I was actually remarking on this the other day where I'm having fewer and fewer conversations, almost none now, about like what is a design system. most of the time when I talk to folks 3 years ago, I would have had to explain like what is a design system, or at least like what our version of a design system was. Nowadays, like it's that everybody knows them, and it's starting to be more conversation about like how important are these things instead of what are they.
What do you think is one thing that everyone misunderstands about design systems current day?
I mean, there is still a lot of that undercurrent of like, this limits my choice. And I think that is an interesting take. And it comes from this idea that like somehow the constraints of a system are imperiling your ability to be creative. And I don't think that that's actually necessarily true at all. I think that like we all work within constraints. There's constraints in our medium. There's constraints in Figma. There's constraints in the web. There's constraints kind of all over the place. And having like a truly free-form way of creating something, like not only does it not exist, it's actually like not really good if you think about it.
Yeah,
like
I agree.
The idea that I can make anything regardless of my brand constraints, or regardless of like the tone and voice or message I want to convey, that's just not the way it works. And so I still get a lot of skepticism about the role of design systems in putting guardrails on what people can create. And good design systems, they feel natural. To strike a hopeful tone, I do see that like more and more every single day. People being like, oh, I can actually make better software with design systems because I'm not sitting there arguing about like, what my border radius is for this button. I'm actually working on some like interesting new experience that I normally wouldn't have time for. And that attention and focus and the creation of that is really important.
For sure. And I think too, like the aspects of creativity within a design system constraint, it's like, it depends on what your role is, right? Because if you are the person who is either coming up with the brand tokens or like the look and feel of the brand, and you're trying to turn that into a design guide, you might be responsible for figuring out what the border radius is and kind of defining the guidelines for everybody else. So there is a feeling a little bit of like, well, I'm disconnected from that if I'm further down the pipeline, right? And I just have to take those tokens and work them into my day-to-day design. But I think the recurring theme is it frees you up to make other creative decisions. So it is important to a degree, but you don't want to keep rehashing those smaller decisions every single day. You want those to kind of be baked in for a period of time so that you can focus on the overall user experience, right?
Definitely. I think there's this interesting sort of emergent philosophy in design systems that I'm really keen on right now. And that is that there is sort of this foundational part of a design system, almost like the core of it, right? Which is very, very interconnected to brand. And that's something that is like pretty immutable. Not that many people touch that part of it. Not that many people make major contributions to that part of it. It does change from time to time, but usually that's like a big organizational strategic change, right? Like I'm redesigning my brand. And then there's the places where you actually implement the design system into your products. And, in big enterprises, this ends up being a systems of systems model. In smaller enterprises, you oftentimes have this idea of like some core components and then extensions of those components that you're actually using in implementation. But there's this other interesting half that is kind of the opposite of that core foundational thing, which is this idea of like this highly creative space where you're taking those foundational components and you're changing them or adding new variations or extending them into what you actually need to get the job done at the product level. And so design systems get to play in this really interesting space where like you simultaneously have this very tightly controlled part of that ecosystem, and then this part that should be pretty free and open and allow people to play with it or change it in a way that makes it right for them. And that's like where the magic of contribution happens. And it's not totally unlike the open source community that you and I were both a part of, right? This idea that like, you had this core concept of what Drupal was, but then there was this entire like modular framework for it, for how you could extend it any which way you wanted. And I think design systems sort of function in that same kind of systems realm.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess I'm curious. I noticed like, as you were describing that, I was thinking, do you feel like design systems are inherently more useful or valuable when you're designing products as opposed to a handful of marketing websites? Or do you think they are just globally useful no matter what you're designing?
I think they're useful in a similar way. I mean, like, look, the real power is if you're able to unify those things, right? If you have that common brand expression and that brand exists in your product and exists in your marketing and it exists in any digital space that you could imagine. And I mean, I think there's even opportunities for design systems in the world of like physical collateral, but we're pretty far away from that right now. I think that the real value is if you're able to unify that foundation. Now, when you extend that foundation, marketing typically has very different needs than products, right? You need to showcase pricing or display a product or get people to have some conversion goal that's around signups or buy nows or demos or whatever. Whereas in a product, your conversion goals are usually like North Star metrics. Like how often are people using this? How often are they logging in? Like what is the actions that they're taking inside of the product that actually lead to customer value? And so the application of that core brand is very different in a product setting than it is in a marketing setting. But that's not necessarily two design systems. That's two extensions of the same design system for different use cases. This can also work with like house of brands kind of ideas, right? The idea of like, I'm one company that has 50 or 100 brands or something like that, right? You can extend a core foundational brand or a core foundational set of UI elements into each of those brands as their own sort of subsystem. It's also like, it's really interesting, right? Because we have lots of customers at Knapsack that have heaps of internal apps, like HR apps or warehouse management apps or kiosk apps in their offices and physical spaces. All of those also represent sort of these interesting extensions of that core system. But I think the point there is it's all one system, because very often you find these really unexpected and kind of interesting ways of sharing that value between marketing and product, between a warehouse app and a customer e-commerce experience. And the availability of that stuff in a single system and the ability to discover it becomes the focus.
That's interesting. Yeah. I guess, do you feel like it's still just as important to convey branding within internal applications that only employees are using?
I mean, I think so. Like the designer in me says so, right? The idea that like, if you're somebody that is working for, let's take your company and like, let's imagine a future where Pinata is like 100,000 employees. And so in that case, if you have an HR app, like that's a part of your brand, right? Like that core experience and that core expression of who you are. And it's not just about like a logo and a color system, right? It's about the principles and the guiding idea of what the company embodies and what its mission is. And a really good brand takes all those things and really is thoughtful about that application across every customer, employee, partner experience that you could imagine. And so, yeah, I think it is important. It maybe is not as important as like dollars in a shopping cart or some like really clear ROI metric for the business growth. But at the same time, that reinforcement of that value system at kind of every part, it matters.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess I got to see this firsthand because I had the opportunity to, be at Red Hat when we were going through a rebrand, when we were doing the work of like actually changing the logo and tweaking the brand colors. It's still red, for obvious reasons, but, kind of changing the palette and then trying to roll that out across marketing, websites, internal applications, customer facing applications. There's just a huge amount of digital properties within Red Hat. And so I got to be a part of that, of kind of translating those brand guidelines into a design system. I'd say it was easy. I don't know if old school is the right word, but like we just use CSS variables or custom, CSS tokens to like say, here's an easy list of, just the basics, the brand colors themselves, primary, secondary, et cetera. We didn't get too far into the weeds with those kinds of tokens because like we knew the applications were going to be so different across the organization, so it's like we didn't get into the semantic weeds on it, but like really having that available to teams to say, hey, you don't have to go through the work of cherry picking things out of a design file. They're already in a consumable format was pretty cool. And I think it's like, yes, the internal applications might kind of be lower on the priority list as far as like rolling this stuff out. But you never want to feel like you're within an organization and you're working in some dusty corner that no one cares about. And so like if you're working on a stale application that doesn't look anything or feel anything like your company, that kind of just shows like, hey, why are we using this? Are people still paying attention to this? Do we need it?
And honestly, I think it erodes trust inside of organizations, right? Like,
yeah.
It's like when your slide deck template doesn't have the right logo in it. Like Knapsack, we just went through a redesign. And it was funny, like the amount of decks that we changed, like the core color palette and applied a new template to and everything like that. I always kind of giggle because it honestly doesn't matter that much if like our all hands deck has the exact right brand on it, right? But at the same time, it matters a ton because the entire company sees that every couple of weeks. And so to have like that sense of trust or that sense of belief that the thing you're looking at is like current and relevant, having it be a part of that brand ecosystem really does matter.
Yeah. Now, okay, be honest. Do you guys like to rebrand more often than the average company because you have to dog food your design system tool?
It's like, well, that was actually a big part of it, right? Is we finally reached what we can consider, truly using our design system to power the majority of things that are Knapsack, right? We, like any small startup, kind of started in this space where like, yeah, we had a design system. It powered a few things, mostly around like tokens. But now we actually have like all our components in there. And it's really heady really quick, right? Because we're a design system platform that powers design systems for customers that also has a design system that powers the creation of the design system platform. And so the levels of meta get like really brain breaking really quick.
Turtles all the way down.
Exactly. Components from top to bottom.
Right. That's fun. I'm imagining there's definitely been a few meetings where people are confused. Which design system are we talking about? What's happening?
Yeah, well, it made naming like all the more important for us. So, for example, our internal design system is called Toby, after Tobias Dancing, who created the knapsack problem, which is an old mathematician problem from like, I don't know, like 80 years ago or something like that. And so we named it Toby for a couple of reasons. Like, first of all, it's our namesake. The whole idea of like, given a finite amount of space and weight, what's the most effective, efficient thing or use of that space? And then secondly, he happened to live in Portland, which is, where the company was founded.
Awesome. Well, let's see here. I wanted to jump back to, I had one more just general design question for you. Like if you're to, zoom out and look back at the last 10 years of design systems in retrospect, what do you think has been the thing that has changed the most and what has surprised you?
This is a really good question coming from you, because I think that like you were one of the first people that I ever met that actually said the word design system out loud in front of me.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, like circa what, like 2014, 2015, something like that.
Wow. Well, I'll wear that as a badge of honor. Thank you.
Yeah. And, trying to think about what's changed. I remember our like first conversations about design systems where they were really engineering centric, thinking about the world in terms of components or in terms of basically like chunks of UI that we could make modular. I'm not even sure that we were using React at the time. I think it was like some implementation of like Twig PHP or something like that.
Oh yeah, definitely Twig.
Yeah, where it was this idea of like, how do you create some sort of modular, reusable piece of a thing? Like we oftentimes talked about it in terms of engineering abstractions and how you would alter those abstractions based on particular use cases. And like that was really narrow if you think back on that, because we were just thinking about like what that developer experience looks like to construct a web page inside of a CMS platform. And now we think about design systems as this like really encompassing thing that is about design, it's about engineering, it's about documentation. It's about shipping the tools you need to be effective with your design system. Like most of our design systems have like, linter configurations in them and stuff like that. Or like, this is how you get it to set up and work with your CI, or this is how you integrate with Figma Token Studio. And it's any number of instruction sets, not just about what the design system does, but how to use it. And I think that at the time, like, had we had that conversation about what they look like now, we would have both kind of laughed and said, like, that's a lot.
So it's really grown. Yeah.
Yeah. It's become so much more encompassing and so much more foundational. I think that it's only even been since I started Knapsack with Evan that I've really thought about design systems as these really foundational things to the future of the way we build product. And what I mean by that is, we're all moving towards a much more systems-based worldview because scale is hard and everybody is resource constrained and everybody's roadmaps get bigger and more ambitious every single iteration. To meet this challenge at scale, the big thing that we all are focused on is how do we derive continual recurring value out of the stuff we create? And that has become this like really core concept that is driving the creation of a lot more product a lot faster than it's ever existed before. And that's innately cross-discipline. And that's innately based in this idea of like data is structured in these design systems in such a way that components that we've built or patterns that we've built are reusable over and over and over again across like not just one product or one feature, but an entire ecosystem. And if you think about that, that really places design systems at the heart of the strategy for how your company creates product. And I had not initially thought of them that way, to be honest. I thought of them as ways of like being another developer tool. And now it's, to me, something that represents like a really strategic platform, almost like infrastructure for how we think about building product, akin to something like Git, where, Git controls how we manage and flow code around. This is how we manage and flow our patterns around our ecosystem.
I can definitely see that. Yeah. I mean, do you feel like if design systems is this big, lovely umbrella for a lot of things, do you think it's fair to say that even the process of, how we do handoffs and how we communicate with one another and how we flow work through the pipeline of our organization, does that all fall under that design system umbrella?
I think so. Look, if I were a designer coming out of school right now, looking at like the career landscape, I'm not sure that I would spend a bunch of time learning how to create a bunch of high fidelity things in today's design tools. Because like, think about the point of design tools, right? Yeah, like actually, let me just ask you that question. What do you think the point of a design tool is?
Ooh, well, I guess it depends. It depends on what your original goal is. Because like, okay, so you're a designer and you're being tasked with, setting up the design system and kind of creating those brand guidelines, which, we just did at Pinata. We just had a meeting about it the other day. It's lovely. We're kind of rolling it out and showing everybody, hey, here's our new look and feel, right? You might be more invested in setting up like all these different examples of visuals and conveying the feeling of a design. But if you're tasked with solving a design challenge, meaning how a user is going to gain information, how are they going to browse your website, find what they need, how are they going to go through the product and take care of the tasks that they need to take care of, you're kind of closer to the side of like doing those iterative wireframing type tasks. And maybe the design system is great because instead of just a square on the page, you can actually drag something in that resembles an actual card component and it looks much more familiar to everybody and they get it immediately what that thing is.
And you don't have to do a handoff.
Right.
I think that the thing is, and yeah, you're right. There's lots of different reasons why we have design tools. What really kind of hit about that is design tools are about a way of being able to express intent. And when we think about like that intent, it comes in lots of different forms, right? We have this idea, like, and this is deeply philosophical. I understand there's probably gonna be a bunch of designers that disagree with me, but there's this idea that like, okay, so we have to take something that doesn't exist and we have to give it form. But how often does that actually happen in a large enterprise? The vast majority of the time, like what UXD or production design is right now, is it's like, let's take a bunch of things that are already built and let's tweak them. Whether that's templates that we find on the internet or UI kits that we find on the internet or existing product or any number of other things. Design is a lot of like, let me take something and let me modify it for a particular use case or a particular need. And we do that inside of tools that aren't the actual code because they're easier to work with. It creates this more rapid iteration or this more rapid way of experimenting and testing out ideas. But with the advent of AI and the advent of design systems, where you have a bunch of abilities to take what you have now in code and very easy and very quickly manipulate it without having to know code yourself, I'm not sure that there's really like a huge future there if you're, even Figma, right? Which is wildly popular. If you're able to actually just create with code and you shortcut that entire handoff process and you're building with things that also like include all of the design decisions you can make instead of just a subset that exists in the design tool, that's a much more powerful future. And that's really interesting to me, right? Like the ability to say, like, let me, as a professional designer, be able to understand how state works in the app I'm actually designing in for the first time ever, or how animation really works in HTML instead of in like some sort of, not quite perfect animation emulation in a design tool. And so, I don't know, like I said, if I was just finishing school right now and looking at that, I would start to think about like, how can I use AI and code to more easily create experiences instead of trying to think about like, how do I move, something visual around that relies still on approximation? I mean, being honest, like what we're doing in Figma is still drawing boxes on a canvas. Like that's what we're doing. And like those boxes are really important and they convey meaning. But if I'm able to make those same boxes using code in that same sort of way, like why would I ever use a design tool?
Yeah, exactly. Let's get into AI a little bit. I know you just touched on this last week with Taylor, but I think, it's the talk of the town, so let's do it. I think the consensus so far, right, is AI hopefully is going to free up humans to do the more interesting things. And I think, Brad Frost touched on this in his blog post, but I kind of feel like there's still some, I'll say this word embracing, like I love this word, but like chores, there's chores tucked in there that fall to humans. So for example, if AI could act like a little design system factory, it writes the boilerplate code for components, you ask it to add, a handful of variants and properties, whatever, it's still going to be a human choice to choose between red 50, color primary, or alert warning, right? Like there's always different layers within the token system to say, why am I choosing this color? So that inherent question of why we're doing a thing, why we're making a design choice is now being pushed to the forefront because the AI is going to make a lot of the other stuff easier. And what's funny to me is like, this was always kind of a point of friction for both designers and developers because it feels like a chore to say like, well, I don't know, I can see the color red on the page. I know it needs to be red. Just let me type in the hex value for it, right? And it's like, well, no, but you have to use the correct, design token, the correct variable. You can't just throw it in there. And the reason for that is so that these systems can choose to, can evolve. And so you can convey the correct meaning to your user because like, are you choosing it because you want it to match brand? You want it to be the call to action on the page, or you want to convey something is wrong. Don't click that warning, And so you have to pick the right choice. So we still need that, like that critical thinking, that systems thinking.
Yeah, no, that expression of intent, right? This gets back to the constraints conversation that we talked about a little bit earlier, right? The design system acts as those guardrails and that set of constraints that an AI can work within. And I think this is the really interesting place for AI, right? There's tons of whiz-bang shit out there on the internet that shows like, design copilots for Figma and like, how do I, create a web page using plain language prompts and all that other stuff. But all of that has a gap right now where, a major corporation, even one that's just getting started like Pinata, I doubt you'd put what those things were able to create into production. And so
probably not.
like, right. And the reason why is because there's still a lot of like expert craftsmanship that goes into that, right? Like, what are the performance implications of this particular component that AI generated for me? Or, how does this function at scale with 1,000 users instead of like one user in a tech demo? Maybe that's even not ambitious enough. How does it function with 1 million users? All of those sorts of things are still aspects that humans really want to touch. And humans are responsible for the system. I still think that the design system is largely defined by humans. And sure, we can have, an AI generate variants of a component for us and even generate some fairly boilerplate component code for something simple like a button. But the moment you get to a higher level of complexity, having humans involved in the choices that exist inside of my design system, that really matters. And then AI can do the assembly of those components in interesting and unique ways, or even maybe extend those components in interesting and unique ways to fit a particular use case. I'm not entirely sure what the interface for this looks like yet, but it's some combination of visual design akin to what we do now in a Figma or a Sketch or something like that, combined with prompting that is assembling those components, right? Like maybe you're telling something like, hey, Knapsack, let's start with a header and a footer and give me some space in between those things. And then let's add, a hero. And then, okay, well, that hero isn't exactly what I was looking for. Can we do a different variation of that hero? And then, okay, can I add a layout to this? Okay, I've added a layout. I want that to be a 3-column layout. I want a card in each one of those columns. I want that second card to have a call to action and a highlight ribbon. And that would be kind of the idea of how you would construct an experience using components, because all of the things that I mentioned would be components in your design system that would have a lot of these choices pre-baked into them. And like, you're not going to get everything yet, but I think you're going to get really close to replicating that similar process that people go through in a tool like Figma directly in code without having to write a single line of code.
I think too, like touching on the craftsmanship aspect, maybe if the AI is creating kind of that low level stuff and spitting it out onto a page, there's still something to be said for taking the step back and looking at it and going, hang on, this combination of all of these things on the page doesn't quite add up the way I thought it would. The flow doesn't feel right. This is too distracting. And I really need the user to pay attention to this first and kind of flow their way through the page. It was reminding me, I was thinking of like when we had design system pages within Red Hat that would kind of just spit out a bunch of components on the page and you could play with them to see what they would do. And the pages were so ugly. Like, we're like, don't ever choose these settings. This is just a demo to show you all of what's possible. But you could create, forgive the language, we always say, ugly babies. You could create some ugly babies with these things that were branded, that, all of the variants were approved or whatever, but like the combination of them was hideous. There's still that design eye that's necessary. And honestly, too, just like understanding the goals of the user and how they're supposed to interact with that digital experience and like, what are they trying to get out of it and what's going to be best for them.
And isn't that the more interesting design work than just drawing boxes anyway?
Hell yeah.
It's interesting, right? Because designers have been separated from the medium that their work is destined for. I've oftentimes used this comparison where I say like designers are basically drawing pictures of these really beautiful cakes to display in a window, and then having no say in like how those cakes are actually made in a kitchen, right? And so it's up to engineers to look at that cake and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to make that with vanilla with some funfetti. There's going to be some cream cheese in that frosting, and I'm going to put like chocolate cherries on the top instead of the maraschinos that were in the picture, right? And so like that's tough. And I think that the reason why that's tough is because in a picture of a cake, you can't describe the flavor. You can't describe the texture of it. You maybe can write that out, but you still don't really have a lot of influence in that. And so in a similar way, like designers can say like, you know, we should have X transition animation, or it should feel like a fluid experience when you unfurl something or something like that. But unless you can actually touch that experience in code, you're always dealing with a visual approximation of the thing a user will see. And so the design system gets us all in the kitchen together, designers and engineers and even product people. And heck, I think content people also have a role in this too, where we can all get in the same medium and work together to make a better cake that we all kind of agree is like the right cake to make. Let's all go work in the medium it's destined for, so that instead of saying like, oh shit, that end product doesn't look like my Figma file, like you never had a Figma file to begin with. You were all just working in the thing that was ultimately what a user was going to see.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this kind of touches on like the process question I was asking before. It's like the design system includes those conversations around intent and around how the user is supposed to flow through the page. And I mean, you know, at Pinata, we're a small, lean startup, and, you know, we're trying to get a lot done very quickly with a few resources. And so it's like, if I'm building a mock-up, do I have the time to build a mobile and a tablet and a desktop mock-up, or can I just throw it onto a desktop mock-up and give a quick, you know, description about what it's supposed to do and allow the developers to kind of infer, okay, this is what it should probably do on mobile. I think the key part of that is, what is the content flow? And this is going to get into a little bit of a topic that we talked about before. We share similar views on outlines, like starting with an outline format for your webpage. It's like, what's most important? Put it at the top. You know, how does this content match the other content on the page? Where are the relationships? And then where does it break into a new topic and so on? So you really have to have that shared understanding of like, what are all these puzzle pieces doing on the page together and how do they relate to one another?
Absolutely. And you know, much like a cake is based in a recipe card, a bullet list of components with an order and a depth is a lot like the recipe for a website. And how that gets interpreted by a browser is like what our ultimate, you know, destination looks like in that case, not necessarily a baked cake. But I think that you're absolutely right in that like you have a hierarchy to the things that exist inside of the web, and components or patterns, having an understanding of the order of those things and their related depth on a page, that's ultimately what we're feeding into web browsers. It's not visual data. It's not this is to the left of this or this is above this. The browser interprets all that for us. And we're used to this idea still that I think comes from print media, right? Where, you know, we had to have an analog in print to digital. And we kind of figured out that like, okay, maybe websites are digital posters. And then we said, well, like, it's actually not really true. Like, you know, there's different viewport sizes. We should make the posters reorganize themselves if the poster gets smaller. I'm like, oh, well, that's actually not really right either, because there's all sorts of problems with that in terms of system technology or context. So like, let's make it so that like these things have some sort of like dynamic way of shifting their context. And now we're in this situation where the visual approximations don't really mean anything at all anymore, right? Because you could be using assistive technology and never actually look at the visual part of a web page ever. And so representing like a snapshot of a comp is really weird to me, because it's like a brain in a jar, right? Like, yeah, for that exact viewport at that exact setting, it might look like that. But there is very few situations where even half your users are going to have that exact same sort of settings in their destination medium to make it look that way.
True. I mean, do you think that there's a future where we could hand AI that content outline, a nice pile of design tokens, maybe throw in some markdown, and then it'll kick out a website, like a correct website?
Yeah, I think you get really close. And honestly, I don't think we're all that far away from it, right? The idea of like, okay, here's a design system full of components and design tokens. What's the user problem I'm trying to solve? I'm trying to solve a product detail page where people can, you know, add and remove items to a shopping cart And it also has a ribbon of related content or related products. I bet you that AI could generate a pretty decent one of those. It may be a ugly baby, like you said, but it at least is a huge step forward and a starting point that now you're just doing the normal design thing where you're taking something that you had previously and you're modifying it to be exactly what you want.
Well, I want to switch gears here, and I want to talk a little bit more about Knapsack specifically. I wanted to hear from you. Tell us a story. Tell us about like one of the early clients that helped provide crucial feedback and ultimately made Knapsack better.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many folks to give a shout out to in this because I think all of our customers, every single one that we get, we learn a lot from. I mean, we mostly deal with big enterprise organizations. I think that Vista, the folks that make Vistaprint and 99 Designs and the whole Simpress group and everything like that, they've been really interesting for us because they took a really early risk on Knapsack. I mean, they spent a relatively small dollar amount with us to kind of run us as an experiment to start with. And now it's, more than 10 times the size it was when it started. And it has gone from brand to brand to brand and part of the organization to part of the organization and team to team. And what's interesting is like how we got there is we had, somebody that we'd worked with at a previous organization that had moved there and kind of brought us into that organization. Is like, hey, what these folks are doing is really interesting. We should work with them. And we found the first place where we had to support multiple coding languages in the same environment across multiple brands in a situation where kind of that systems of systems concept applied to us for the first time. And there was a lot of interesting and unique challenges that we were able to sort of solve together using Knapsack that has kind of let them have that systems viewpoint become not just like a new experiment for them, but the way they do things. And there's a really interesting conversation with Mike Bowser there, where he said, like, the brilliance of all this is that anybody that interacts with our design system now has the opportunity to leave it better than they found it. And that idea of contribution and how that contribution flows through their work, that's really powerful. And I'm super proud of conversations like that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Feels like walking down the nature trail, pick up something, a piece of trash, you see it, leave it better than you found it.
Totally. To give a sense of like how early it was, I think that, we had like a real product in market for like a month or two at the time. And like, we had just figured out how to make it so that you had user accounts. And
one user account.
Right, exactly. And I mean, we put them through like, all of our pricing experimentations and a bunch of other like things that we had to figure out kind of together to get them to be able to like buy software from us. But like they see the value in us and they keep, encouraging us and, using more of our software.
What a great symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Yeah, it's like one of the things I'm pretty proud at Knapsack is, the vast majority of our customers, they buy some sort of small subset of the software, right? And then what they do is before we even reach 1 year, before we even reach renewal, they find the value in it. And most of the time, like customers are tripling their spend. And what they're doing is it's not like we're just jacking up the price, right? It's that the number of users quintuples. We have several different customers that have more than 100 users and a couple of customers that have more than 1,000 users that, have grown dramatically. And the adoption of Knapsack has been something that's become pretty fundamental to the way they build product. And that's really awesome to see, right? Like when you can have like one very small, very contained part of an organization say, yes, we're going to try this. And then to realize the value of it and watch that spread like wildfire inside of a company. That's really cool.
Would you say that you've gone viral inside the company?
Yeah, like within that one organization, right? And it's kind of fun because you get to sit there and you get to like point at metrics and say like, here's like ROI and here's like all the cool stuff that we're able to do. And you can kind of like walk that around an organization and show other product owners the value of something like that. And they're like, yes, we're buying it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just like a lot of just innate groundswell within organizations, just as a testament to the power of Knapsack.
Yeah, and it's this fun sort of category creation work that we're doing, right? Because like very few companies have bought design system SaaS software before, right? It's not like a common line item that you see in a departmental or organization budget. And so most of the time we're new budget. Like people are creating budget for us. And usually that created budget is pretty small. I mean, you well know this working at a big enterprise company, right? Like if you wanted to use a new vendor that you'd never bought software like that before, you're probably not getting $1 million to do that with out the gate.
Right.
So what's cool is seeing, customers see the value and then decide that not only do they just want to spend more, they want to like watch this be a bigger part of how they think about the creation of product.
Awesome. Okay, so I wanted to ask you kind of this angle, like when you're building a tool like Knapsack, there's always a lot of decisions to be made around where to give users options, where to let them do their own thing, and then places where you might say, look, we've tried this all, we've been around the block with design systems. This is where we're going to draw the line in the sand of like the best way to do a thing. Tell us about like, what is Knapsack opinionated about?
So we're opinionated about two things, and we're only like mostly opinionated about one of them. The first is that what we're mostly opinionated about is that everything should be based in structured data. And so we store the vast majority of design systems content in Git as markdown files, JSON, YAML configurations, etc. And any component code that exists inside of Knapsack also comes with a schema definition. And that schema definition is sort of the rules for how that component can be used. Now, you don't need to specify that rule set, and we'll still render that component for you so you can like see it and touch it. But in that case, we're not doing anything like all that different than say like what Storybook is doing. For us, having that data schema that defines all of your different props and also uses a slot spec to understand how components relate to one another, that's the key, because that lets you assemble experiences and change the variation of those experiences into actual like prototype pages. And that's where a lot of power gets unlocked, right? Because now instead of just saying, like, I'm going to look at a card in isolation, it's like, I'm going to look at a card, I'm going to look at a card with a button, I'm going to look at the card in the context of a page. And all those are examples that can be saved in your design system so that people can understand and empathize with what you're actually trying to build.
Yeah, context is everything.
Exactly. And so that ability to say all of it is based in structured data, there's another effect of that, which is that everything can be rendered as an API call. And so you can make an API call to Knapsack and have it return to you like the data schema, the actual like template language code that you're using, whether it's like React or Vue or web components or whatever. And then it can also return to you the sample data itself. And so you can get like HTML and CSS, you can get the base code, you can get the data schema, and you can get the sample content all via an API call. And that's really powerful because that API call is also version controlled. So if you're an implementer and you're saying like, I need this part of my button spec for version 1 of my design system, and you're in another product and you need it for version 1.1, you can make that callback and get exactly the same result. And so that creates a lot of trust in the system. And the second thing is another part about trust, right? Like we have a pretty specific idea of workflow where we want people to think about workflow the same way that engineers think about it in Git. But we don't want to have them like download Git and understand like what all the different Git commands actually mean. In our UI, we basically have the idea to create a branch in Git. And then a branch is a place that is essentially a workspace that is all your own. You can also share it with other people and you can all collaborate in the same branch at the same time. And then it controls how the design system changes when you ultimately want that branch to go back into the main design system and become that next thing. And so you can request reviews, you can commit that branch, and you can even publish a new version of your design system all from our UI. And the intent is like, design systems are really powerful, but like, to quote Uncle Ben, like with great power comes great responsibility. And if anybody can just change your primary color in your design system, that's a little scary because that has a lot of effects in product. And so using that abstraction of Git, you can basically control how things are changed and then how those changes get published downstream into your products.
Makes a lot of sense. I think you're right. It's like having a source of truth feels stable, feels like you have a sense of certainty about things. It doesn't feel like chaos because like those of us who, started in the olden days of creating, mockups in Photoshop or even in XD, it's like if you have a design file, you're like final. Okay, this time for real final. Like you have all these iterations of design files. And so it's nice to know like what version is this literally? Is this the most recent version?
Totally. And like you have one that is in like, Dropbox and another that is like going around in email, right? Like
yes.
That's a huge problem that a lot of this tries to solve. And that actually gets me to like the unopinionated thing, right? We're very unopinionated about what content you put in your design system. Like you can put your grocery list in there. You could, upload a bunch of pictures of your dog. Like the idea of the content itself we're pretty unopinionated about how that content gets constructed because everybody's design system content is different. And oftentimes it uses different coding languages and multiple different coding languages. And so we also have very limited opinions on like what coding language you should use. Like, yeah, I mean, React's really popular, but 5 years from now, is there going to be something that replaces React? What happens after? Especially the speed at which JavaScript frameworks are advancing. You can put Tailwind in our system. You can put Material in our system. You can have your own custom set of components. We don't really have a strong take on the right way to construct a design system from a content perspective. And that also makes this really flexible. So if you're an enterprise that already has a bunch of components created, it's pretty easy to just put those in Knapsack. If you're a small company that wants to grab something off the shelf and start with that, it's pretty easy to get that into Knapsack. And the intent is, as long as you're using structured data and you're using a get-backed controlled way of working, most of the rest of it's pretty open-ended.
I mean, that actually kind of dovetails into my next question. Maybe you've already answered it in a sense, but like, I was wondering, does Knapsack have any plans to sell sort of a turnkey design system where it's like, if I'm really small and I don't have a whole team of people that have opinions about, how to set up the design system, could I kind of get a ready-made kit with all of the basics and maybe a handful of themes to choose from, or I just go in and kind of play with colors and fonts and like really just be off to the races? Is that something in the future that you guys are entertaining?
So we have a starter kit already that basically has a bunch of sort of examples in our system. The hardest part about any of those starter kits is you can either have something that the intent is to build from it, in which case the baseline thing is marginally useful until you build the stuff on top of it that makes it yours. Or you can provide something that's really useful, but probably not specific enough to you to be something that's like production worthy. And this is the problem with anything that exists in this landscape right now. Like, there's lots of companies that use Material. They spend a lot of time ripping stuff out of Material in order to continue to use Material. There's stuff that's getting better, like what Chakra is doing, what the OpenUI project is doing, where there's these like very, very sort of generic, unbranded components that exist out there. But all of them, you're either choosing between this idea of like, I have to build on top of this, or I have to rip a bunch of things out of it. And what we basically decided with our starter kit is we were going to give people a lot of illustrations about how to work, not necessarily like solve the component library for them. Because if you want to use Ant Design, like it's trivial to get that into Knapsack. If you want to use Tailwind, that's trivial too. So pick the starter kit that's out there that you like, that is probably going to be better than the ones that we could create anyway, and then use our examples as ways of working.
So that might be, a great option for very small companies that are just trying to get off the ground and get, something is better than nothing kind of a mantra and, put a little of their own spin on it, but like really just go quickly.
Yeah. And most of our customers are pretty big enterprises. And so very often there's at least one, if not a dozen design systems that already exist at some state inside of their organization. And it's more about adopting those and figuring out how to like, find all the duplicate stuff and reduce it down into variations of a common set of patterns. Like that ends up being the place that we spend a lot of time with our customers, is in that process, a little less in like, where do I start from?
So if you had a magic wand and you could add any feature, no matter how complex or whatever, to Knapsack right now, what would it be and why?
Well, it's the feature we're working on, actually. Oh. And so, right now, like AI is our big focus. And the things that we're doing with AI first are we're doing a bunch of cool stuff around discovery of documentation and components in the system. So like a spotlight style prompt that allows you to say like, hey, I'm trying to figure out how to correctly use a call to action, and then have it to be able to return to you like the right documentation URL and give you a summary of that documentation directly in a prompt. And so that's going to really help with like component use and component discovery. And then there's a bunch of like quality of life things, right? Like, hey, like make a dark mode for me and don't just have that be inverting my core palette, or like give me a type scale based on, the type scale that I've defined over here, or give me a color step scale, like, red 50 through 500. So all those little quality of life things. But the real interesting stuff is taking what we can already do with the assembly and collection of components into prototype experiences and AI augmenting that. And again, we don't totally know what the user interface for this is yet. But if I could wave a magic wand, I would have a new UX experience that allowed you to basically construct pages and prototype experiences based on components using language prompts.
Wow. Well, that's really exciting. I kind of buried the lead here with our, we talked about AI already, and you're like, by the way, hopefully that wasn't a spoiler.
Yeah, this is happening. It's one of those things that we're just now starting to talk about because we've been talking about machine learning and AI in our app for like 2.5 years, but we've always had a problem with technology maturity. And just last fall, it was funny. I just given a presentation at a Google event about the future of generative AI and how it's not just for like exhaust manifolds on motorcycles anymore, and how like digital generative AI was this thing that was coming. And then November happened and like, holy shit, all of a sudden it's here, right? And so this idea of how we use LLMs to augment the creative process inside of design systems, it's suddenly possible. And not only is it possible, it's really important, I think, to the future of this entire like ecosystem. And so, yeah, I mean, we're working really hard on that right now.
That's awesome. Does that make it harder to create roadmaps? Like if you're working with AI right now and it's changing so rapidly, is it hard to project like where you and your company are going to be in 3 years or 5 years?
Yeah, a startup that says they actually know where they're going to be in 5 years is like probably not being honest. But
we can all dream.
Yeah, I mean, well, you can have a vision, right? I think that the vision for me is that people take the creative process of building products and they use Knapsack to do it. That's to me like what I see us doing, right? It's like there's not going to be like, here's a bunch of code tools, here's a bunch of design tools. It's going to be like there's one platform where you build your products inside of it. And you do a combination of things with code, a combination of things with like visual design, and all of it is augmented with AI to allow us to build better products faster. And that's what I want. Like, that's the thing I want to build. And I think that there's a lot of cool like momentum in our direction for that. And so, keeping that in mind as like, that's the thing we're building, we're pretty good at seeing like the next 6 months. getting much further along than that is a little bit hard. Like, for example, one of the things we also really want to do is we also really want to build in a system that understands like what contributions and what units of work need to exist inside of the design system. So like, what do I do to improve this? What do I do to contribute to it? And so almost like issue queue management, but probably not as heavy as like a Jira or a GitHub issues type thing, that allows you to integrate with those platforms to understand like what you need to improve the design system. So like we really want to build that too. And that's, I think, the challenge of any startup company at our stage is like, there's what the customers are telling you, there's what the market's telling you, there's what you have in your head as a vision. And it's about like kind of piecing together what's the most important thing that you can work on, given all of those different pressures and factors. Because everybody has runway, everybody has constrained amounts of resources. And it's about kind of trying to figure out like what's the most important.
Yeah. Tough decisions to be made. Well, okay. So I kind of want to end here with a couple of little grab bag questions, because we're coming off the rails of like AI in the future, and this is going to be amazing. I want to rewind and say, like, let's go back to core HTML. Why is date picker not a component yet? Why is it not an HTML tag? Why is card not an HTML tag?
Yeah, W3C, if you're listening to this, honestly, I hope that HTML6, like it is, right? I think that the ability to have a bunch of solved problems in UI exist as a part of a spec would do so much for us, right? Like, this makes me crazy because the whole trend is still like native apps, right? And like, oh, fucking native apps. Like, there's so
Tell
much.
us how you really feel.
Right. There's so much that is a native app experience that is just an encapsulated web experience that drives me crazy. Like, there is definitely a time and a place for native apps where you're taking something you couldn't do on the web and you're putting that on a device-centric thing. But so many people create native apps just simply because like the patterns are better defined there, or like you have access to things that you can't access in the web. And I think that like the web kind of missed the boat on some of this stuff where like had our spec or had our idea of like what the web could be, could have evolved faster. The web is a much better platform than having a freaking app for everything. Right.
Well, and I mean, web components are the bridge, like anybody's listening. I'm sure a few of my coworkers and past coworkers are saying, what do you mean? We worked on a web component library. Like, yes. And, it's supposed to be a bridge that helps you to build and teach the browser. Hey, this is a basic tag you should already know how to do. But at a certain point, it really should make its way into the spec. Like, let's not keep reinventing the wheel over really basic stuff.
Yeah, I got pretty down and nerdy with Brad Frost about this a couple of weeks ago, where we were basically talking about the idea of like, okay, so if we're able to put date picker is his favorite component. If we're able to put date picker into the HTML spec, like what are the things that exist in the pre-spec state? And we kind of were like, yeah, web components, right? Like if something's a web component for long enough and enough people are using that, like why wouldn't we incorporate that into how we think about HTML and make that something that the browser just knows?
Yeah. I mean, this is just an extension of the design system process, right? Of like teams creating new components. And as soon as a handful of people are using it, great. It's time for it to go into the system, make it official.
Yep, totally.
Yeah.
There's a lot there that's also really interesting about like personalization in the web, right? Like, you get the idea that everybody, especially in the age of AI, carries around some sort of personalization token about how they like their experience to be rendered. And if you have the ability to say like, look, me as Chris, I like densely packed information. I like, few animations or visual distractions. I like a high contrast color scheme. And because I'm getting old, like the font size needs to be 25% larger than average. Like the ability to carry that around and have UI not like completely change itself, but remix it a little bit based on your own personal flavor. Like that does a ton for assistive technology. That does a ton for accessibility. That does a ton for just generally like how we experience the web as individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the main reasons why I'd love to see it move into the spec, which I realize is a lot of work. So it's easier for me to just say, but like, you don't have a bunch of variations out there that are not accessible or difficult for people to use, where my favorite is when you're clicking like the button to toggle to the next month, and it jumps and the button moves around based on the length of the name of the month. I'm like, come on. Like this is
all in the same place, right?
Yeah. Okay, last question for you. Outside of design systems, outside of Knapsack, what are you learning about right now? What are you excited about?
I've actually been spending a bunch of time in the greater systems space, talking about these ideas of systems thinking inside of organizations. And design systems, yes, is like a part of that. It's like a very hard systems concept inside of something that has been, kicking around. And like the idea of systems thinking as an encapsulation of design thinking inside of broader parts of the organization. So if you're in a design ops organization, like design thinking is a part of your day-to-day life, but how is systems thinking changing the way that the enterprise functions around you? So I'm spending a bunch of time there. And then, of course, figuring out how to be in balance between two adorable little boys and a startup and all the other interests that I have. And so I spent a lot of time kind of just trying to figure out what being a parent looks like. And that's wild, right? Like there's still moments of mind-blowingness there that is super crazy.
The final frontier.
Exactly. Hey, Kendall, this has been so much fun. I can't believe it's been an hour already. So I really appreciate you doing this. And honestly, for coming up with the idea, this has been super cool.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care.
That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.